All right, let's start chapter 2. This chapter is on psychological research, and there are 3 modules under this chapter. And we are going to discuss in this chapter not only how psychologists conduct research, and that could be on research with animals, it could be research with humans. We'll talk about how they go about coming up with a research idea, what all is involved in carrying out that research, from beginning of thinking of the idea to eventually communicating it to the public and publishing that in a manuscript. We will end then with the ethical concerns of doing research with humans, and then I will talk a little bit about doing research with animals also. So let's start off with module 4, and this module is called the scientific method. And the 2 questions that we are going to answer in this module is, of course, what is the scientific method? What all does that entail? And then also the second question is, what role do theories and hypotheses play in conducting psychological research? So we'll not only talk about what theories are, but we'll talk about what hypotheses are and how those stem out of theories. Okay, so let's start off with the scientific method. Just a definition overall of what the scientific method is that it is an approach that psychologists systematically, right, there's a system involved in conducting research. So the approach that psychologists systematically acquire knowledge and understanding about behavior and then about other phenomena of interest. So the scientific approach, first off, before I go into the next slide and talk about the various steps in the scientific approach, a good acronym to think about with the scientific approach is OPTIC-R. Okay, so optic, right? So OPTICR. So the first one, O, that's where you make an observation, right? So that would like be your theory. And then the P next is the prediction. And that would be your hypothesis. So you're predicting that in this type of situation, this is likely to occur. The next one is the T, and that is where you are testing your hypothesis. So you're going to carry out your study, right? And in the next chapter, or later on in this chapter, we'll talk about the various types of methods that you could use, whether you're going to do observation, whether you are going to do a survey, whether you're going to do an interview or an experiment. So that's the testing part. The next one is the I, and that is the interpretation. And this is where you do data analysis. So in psychology, we use statistics in order to figure. So we collected all of our data in the testing aspect, right? And now we need to analyze that data to find out whether or not our hypothesis was supported. So we use statistics in order to analyze that data. The next letter is C, and that is communication. And communication is, depending on your analysis, right, depending on your interpretation, if you got statistically significant results, then you would write up those results into a manuscript and you would send that manuscript off for publication, right? And then the last one is R. So we said optic R. The R is replication. So when you write up your data, right, when you write up the analysis, when you write up your study for publication in a manuscript, the replication is that any other researcher out there could do the exact same study that you did, and they should get the same results. They should be able to replicate that study. And we'll talk about that later on in the chapter also. So the scientific method, just remember that acronym OPTIC-R, and those are the steps that are involved with the scientific method. Now, the scientific method is what makes psychology a science, right? We use the scientific method the same way that your other sciences do, like biology and chemistry and physics. They use the scientific method, and we in psychology, we also use the scientific method when we are conducting our research. And that's one of the arguments that we have as psychologists, that psychology is actually a science. All right, so this next one is taken right out of your textbook. This is actually on page 31 in your textbook, and it is figure 1, and it's showing us the scientific method, right, that we had just talked about. No, it doesn't have exactly those optic R, but it's showing you the flow chart that's involved. So the first part is you identify questions of interests, right? Of interest. So that would be like your theory that you come up with. So behavior and phenomena that require some sort of explanation. You could base it on prior research findings, or perhaps that you're just curious, right? You have some sort of creative thought or some insight into why a certain behavior occurs. After that, you're formulating an explanation, right? So you're specifying your theory and you're developing a hypothesis out of that. Again, we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. The second part is where you're actually carrying out your research. You're devising your operational definitions for your hypothesis. You're selecting your research methodology, right? Are you going to do a survey? Are you going to do an interview? Are you going to do naturalistic observation? Or are you going to conduct an experiment? The next part is where you are actually collecting your data, and then you are analyzing your data. So you see so far here we have the O, the P, the T, and the I, right? And then we get to the C, which is communicating your findings, where you are going to write up your study into a manuscript. You're going to send that manuscript off to a journal and hope that it gets published. And then again, that replication is where it could start all over again, right? So someone read your study and they found it interesting and thought, okay, well, they found this. I wonder what would happen if I did this to that study, right? So now you have a whole new hypothesis stemming from that study that you just read. And that's why we say that research is cyclical, right? There's never really any end to research. You may always be able to come up with further questions and theories based on what someone else has found. And that's what keeps research actually going. So this chart, I think, is really nice in showing you how research is actually conducted. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about these theories, and it's specifying some sort of broad explanation. So first off, basic definition for theory is that it is a broad explanation and predictions are made concerning some sort of observation that you had, right? You're sitting at the mall and you're wondering why perhaps there are more people coming out of this store that are dressed a certain way versus coming out of this store. Totally off the top of my head, right? So you have some sort of observation and you're going to try and come up with some sort of explanation or prediction based on that. The theories you have provide a framework for understanding the relationships among a set of unorganized facts or principles. So in doing that, right, you have this unorganized set of facts and principles, and out of that, you're going to have this framework of your explanation for why certain behaviors occur. So the example that the book gives is that you have this theory of a diffusion of responsibility. Now we'll talk about this later on more whenever we get to the social psychology chapter later on in the semester. But this diffusion of responsibility was actually discovered and talked about by Latane and Darley. So Bibb Latane and John Darley. They developed this theory to understand the failure of bystanders to intervene, and this all stemmed from the murder of a lady called Kitty Genovese. So in this case, Kitty Genovese was 20-something years old. She lived in Queens. She got off her shift as a manager at a bar. She was driving home. She pulled into her parking lot, and she was brutally raped and then eventually murdered. 31 of her neighbors actually saw this occurring, and no one called the police to help her. And so there is this diffusion of responsibility. So the theory that Latane and Darley came up with is that the greater the number of bystanders there are, the more responsibility to help is perceived as shared, right? So they have all these neighbors that saw Kitty Genovese being raped and murdered, but they knew that there were other people watching also. And so they shared the responsibility. Well, other people were watching, why didn't they call the police? So the smaller the share, the response, and the smaller the share of responsibility each person feels. So that's the theory that Latane and Darley came up with. Again, the greater the number of bystanders, the more the responsibility to help is perceived as shared, and the smaller the share of the responsibility each person feels. The more people that are around, less people are actually going to help because their responsibility actually decreases. So that's the theory. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is the hypothesis that's coming out of that theory. So with a hypothesis, you're crafting a testable prediction. So a hypothesis itself, you may have learned early on in high school, right, that it is a testable prediction. So it's a prediction stemming from a theory that is stated in a certain way that allows it then to be tested. So you have this theory based on an observation, and you come up with this prediction that you're then going to carry out in a study, and you're going to test it. So if we go back to Latane and Darley's diffusion of responsibility theory, the hypothesis would be the more people who witness an emergency situation, the less likely it is that help will be given to a victim. That's their hypothesis. The more people that are around to witness something occurring, the less likely you are to get help. We also have what's called an operational definition. This is a translation of the hypothesis that you just came up with, and it's the translation into a very specific and testable procedure that can then be carried out, observed, and measured in your study. So how are you operationally defining helping behavior, right? That is what Latane and Darley wanted to see. So you have a theory. Out of that theory, you have a hypothesis. And then with that hypothesis, you have an operational definition of how you are going to actually carry out that study. Let's continue on talking about these hypotheses, crafting testable predictions. So as psychologists, we rely on formal theories and hypotheses for various reasons. We're going to list out 4 different reasons on why psychologists rely on these theories and hypotheses as they're carrying out their study. So the first reason is so that they can make sense of the unorganized, separate observations and bits of data. So they make some sort of observation, and they then need to form a hypothesis. So they're going to take this observation and they're going to make it more organized. They also rely on theories and hypotheses in order to place observations and data within a coherent framework. They place observations and data within a coherent framework. They may also want to move beyond the facts and make deductions about unexplained phenomena. They want to move beyond the facts and make deductions about some of the unexplained phenomena. And then after they ran their study and they analyzed it and they wrote it up, right, there's always, usually always, at the end of a journal article or a manuscript, future research section at the very end. So that is where you're developing ideas for future investigation. You're developing ideas for future investigation. Okay, so that is the first module on the scientific method. We're next going to go into module 5, and that is where you're actually going to conduct your psychological research, and we're going to talk about that then in the next module.